So hello everyone and welcome to Coronavirus Conversations on Workforce Wellbeing. My name is Rebecca Atkinson. I'm from the Museum Association and I'm just going to be facilitating today. This is the fifth in our series of COVID-19 themed webinars. We've previously looked at reopening museums and the future of our workforce, among other things. And today we're focusing on wellbeing and discussing how we can support this during the pandemic and beyond. Before I hand over to our chair, Tamsin Russell, I have a few housekeeping announcements to make. Firstly, although attendees' cameras and microphones are automatically disabled, you can see a list of participants via the link in the menu bar, and you can use the chat function also in your menu bar to talk to others, share links and experiences during the whole conversation today. You can also tweet using the hashtag MA Coronavirus Conversations. If you have a question that you'd like the panel to address, then please share this via the Q&A. You should be able to see this in the menu bar. You can ask a question anonymously, but if you're happy to, then please share your name and organisation if relevant. The chair will put selected questions you've asked to the panel, so please keep these short and to the point to help her out. You can leave and rejoin the webinar at any time, and we are recording the discussion today and it will be available on our website later this week. Due to the nature of today's conversation, I'll also be sharing some links to relevant external organisations, including mental health charities in the chat. Please do add to these if you wish to. I'll also share details of more forthcoming webinars, which are free to all MA members and those who work in institutions that are MA members. Finally, please bear with us if there are any technical problems during the webinar, and feel free to send me a private chat message if you have any troubles. Right, I'll now hand over to Tamsin to get started.
Thank you, Rebecca. And welcome everybody to today's coronavirus conversation. I'm delighted to be holding the space, and I use that term very pointedly around any conversations around wellbeing for today's focus on workforce wellbeing. Wellbeing can be defined as a state of being comfortable, healthy or happy. And certainly I think the sector has excelled in recent years in our focus on audiences and wellbeing through programming, social prescribing and partnerships. Although what I would say in my experience and also my observation, that commitment, that narrative has not always been mirrored internally. Workforce wellbeing should always be on the agenda. But in light of COVID-19 and lockdown and the consequences that we are all living with at the moment and going forward, means that workforce wellbeing needs to prioritise now more than ever. We, the MA, have tried to respond to those needs for our members and the sector as a whole. So having had a look at the participant list, I can see a number of you that have participated in our mentoring programmes, our career conversations, our professional development programmes like the Association of the Museums Association, and most recently our safe space interventions, so our two private Facebook groups, for those of you that may be on furlough, and also those of you that are managing, leading and supervising in crisis. And we will continue to respond with regard to the wellbeing agenda to ensure that our workforce, whether you are a paid employee, volunteer, freelancer or a consultant, are supported during these times. I really want to welcome the panel to share their insights on such a critical topic, and during, for me, as I'm sure a number of you are aware, a very critical week for many in the sector regarding things like redundancy consultations and information. So, you know, I really feel for that. So this is a very timely conversation. Just to give you an outline of who we've got with us to share their insights and expertise, our panellists today are Victoria Hume, who is the Director of Culture, Health and the Wellbeing Alliance, which is a national organisation advocating for anyone who believes in cultural engagement can transform health and wellbeing. She has a background as a composer and as an arts manager for the NHS for 15 years. I'd like to welcome Clara Paillard, who is the trade unionist, historian, currently employed in a museum environment, working on creative projects with community groups. She's a co-president of the Public and Commercial Services Union Culture Group and is passionate about social change and justice, so welcome. And finally, I'd like to welcome Sam Jenkins, who's the co-founder of the Museum Wellness Network. Along with Anna, in 2018, this network was established to help museum workers who were struggling with their mental health and wellbeing, really focusing on raising awareness around staff wellbeing in the sector and trying to provide a supportive platform for those people to know that they're not alone in their experience. The network is run voluntarily. I welcome that, but also know there are well-being connotations around giving your time in a volunteering context. So thank you very much, Sam and Anna. But in Sam's spare time, she works for the People Histories Museum. So thank you and welcome, panellists. Before we start more formally, I really just want to highlight that we really appreciate this topic by its very nature can be raw, can be very personal, and also consuming at times, to the distraction of everything else. So we want to create a safe space here, even though we're recording, for everyone. So please feel free to be able to share your wants and needs through the chat function anonymously, or highlighting who you are, as well as the Q&A. Really want to make sure that we meet your needs by the end of today's session. So in terms of the format, I'm going to ask some questions to the panellists and then hand over to you to answer questions to them from your particular perspectives. So let's start. So Clara, one of the first questions I am interested in hearing about is what you feel have been some of the most significant challenges for workforce wellbeing during this time.
Oh, thanks, Tamsin. Thanks for inviting me. I mean, this has been an unprecedented time. And I think everybody has been through a series of shock in the past 5 months. I mean, first of all, the idea of a pandemic and a lockdown was something that we've never seen in our lifetime for most of us. And so the anxiety around becoming ill, or relatives or colleagues or friends becoming ill, or even sadly passing away, is a very difficult situation to deal with. So dealing with bereavement and those fears is a first step. But also with the lockdown itself, the isolation, the lack of exercise, the lack of social interaction, not be able to see your family, your children sometimes, has been particularly challenging. But I think in terms of the workforce and the impact we've seen on organization, I mean, first of all, you've just mentioned the loss of jobs. And there was a first wave of redundancy immediately after the lockdown. A number of people lost their job then, let's not forget about it. And now we are seeing hundreds of people across the sector facing redundancy. And I'd like to pass my solidarity to all of those. But also, some people have lost income, and the consequences of losing that income on survival, the ability to afford housing is a very important one. Poverty is always underestimated in terms of impact on mental health. Some people didn't have access to sick pay to self-isolate, or if they fell ill, that was, again, a very big stressor. The final point very quickly is that I think for people who had existing mental health disabilities or conditions, it often have been even more challenging because they already were struggling, suffering. They may have been undergoing treatment to help with their mental health, and with the lockdowns, that was often not possible. So a particular thought for people who were already struggling beforehand.
Wonderful, Clara. Sam, any reflections on those challenges? Anything else that you'd like to add?
I think one of the big challenges that I came across, and I've noticed other people have, is also the difficulty with empathizing with other people's experiences during the lockdown and the whole situation, because everyone's experienced things differently. Whether you've been furloughed for months or you've been working from home, you're never going to really be able to understand the other person's situation because it's so completely different, but they're all very, very difficult. And I think similarly with lockdown lifting and us looking at reopening museums now, for some people that's a great step and they're really looking forward to getting back into their buildings, and for other people who might rely on public transport or might be worried about childcare, that might be a whole new level of worries. So yeah, I think that's a big one, and it all fits into this wider situation with change and the unknown, and everyone hates change. We all know that. And it's just been 5 months of change and constant change as well, whether it's being put on furlough or having to adapt to working from home, having to change from doing face-to-face events to online events. It's a completely different way of working, and I think it's been a huge factor for people's well-being, because you can't rely on your previous support structures, you can't rely on your previous known situations, you've just got to try and adapt, and it's exhausting.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. Victoria, anything from your work or reflections?
I mean, everything that you've both said very much echoes what we've heard in the various reports that we've been trying to pull together. I think, so I guess I'm coming at it specifically in relation to people in museums who are involved in work that supports health and wellbeing in the communities they serve. So obviously masses of that work had to just stop completely, as did masses of other work. But there's a big crossover there also with people that have no digital access. So a lot of the digital content that came out so fast and was so brilliant in many ways just couldn't possibly reach a lot of those communities. And I think in a way that sort of reinforced some of the social divides that we're all becoming very aware of, and that has a kind of knock-on effect on us too. You know, we're all being very exposed to the realities of health inequalities in this country in a very disturbing and immediate way, and obviously that's playing into everyone's well-being in different ways. But the other thing I think I'd add is that people are, the sense I get is that people are really missing their communities. It's not just, you know, missing their colleagues at work, obviously, but also the communities that we work with all the time. And at the beginning, when we were speaking to museum professionals, they were talking about their concern for their volunteers and all the people they work with on a regular basis. But that's a mutual thing. I think, you know, that community is also a support to us as professionals, and you know, gives us meaning in our work. And that is a huge loss that some people are finding ways to reach those communities, which is fantastic, but there are additional challenges that come with that too. So anyway, maybe we come back to that a bit later.
Yeah, and just sort of picking up on some of those points, I think, you know, that very personal nature around our own situation and experience, and how that can be moderated by our own situation and experience, and sometimes amplified, is really important, and not to underestimate that, and the fact that it is dynamic as well. So we've talked about first waves of redundancies, we've talked about phases of the process, so 5 months, all of those things have an impact. So just moving on to next question. Sam, we're going to start with you to explore this a bit more. From your perspective, is there anything you have seen organisations do well to support their workforce, or is there anything you feel that organisations could do more of to support their workforce in the broadest sense?
I always say that the easiest solution to starting to support workforces more is communication. Museums need to be communicating with their staff what the plans are for the future, how long people are going to be working from home if that's the plan. Even if they just don't know what's going to happen yet, they need to be communicating with their staff, because otherwise people just start imagining. And as many of us know, when you start imagining, you tend to imagine the worst case scenario. And alongside communicating, they need to listen to staff as well. They need to make sure they're listening to people's worries and their ideas, especially around reopening. Your front of house staff, for example, are absolute experts in what the visitor journey is like. So you need to listen to them if they have worries about where pinch points might be, or where staff may have to interact with visitors, and that might cause dangerous situations. And when they're listening, they need to be flexible with staff as well, and staff needs. As we start to reopen, especially, some people might be able to go straight back into the museum buildings with no problem, but other people might have caring responsibilities. They might be reliant on public transport and not feel quite ready to take that step. I'm one of those people. I need to get a train into central Manchester, and week by week I'm thinking, oh, am I quite ready for that yet? So yeah, I think those are my big three: just communicate, listen, and be flexible.
Wonderful, thank you, Sam. Victoria, what could organisations do or have done to support workforce?
I think I'm noticing at the moment that there's a sort of shift happening. At the beginning, there was we perhaps, although everybody was working like crazy trying to change programs, it felt like there was a bit more space for checking in with people and seeing where we all were. And I've noticed in the last couple of weeks that we seem to be moving into a slightly different phase, and there's perhaps a bit less space for that now. And I sort of want to hang on to that, the principle of just, you know, being open about where everyone is. I mean, it's really building on what you're saying, Sam, about communicating, but I think specifically creating space to communicate about mental health. There was a good blog that the NCVO put out a couple of weeks ago, talking about leadership in the charity sector and saying that, you know, a great way of supporting mental health in your colleagues is to be open about it yourself. This is speaking to leaders within the charity sector. So I think where directors and leaders are able to be quite open about the challenges that they're experiencing, that can free up your staff to feel more confident about the way that they can speak about their own issues. But I do think, you know, on the plus side, I think there have been some good examples of people, sort of new kind of mutual support evolving. I was speaking to some colleagues yesterday who were talking about how they're having more personal conversations, reconnecting with people, making a bit more time to check on each other. So that is out there. And then I think the last thing I'd say is that it's really striking that where museums have managed to keep those connections going with their communities, that's had a knock-on benefit for the well-being of the workforce. So, you know, feeling like, again, going back to the point about having a sense of purpose and the meaning in your work, I think where that's been maintained, it's really helped the workforce as much as it has people who've been taking part in those programs.
Yeah, modelling those good behaviours for all of our constituents is really important. Yeah, wonderful. Clara, anything else you'd like to add in terms of either good practice you've seen or hopes in terms of what museums could do as we enter another phase?
I think it's been very difficult for the employers because it's new. We've never gone through this before. But what we've seen is that there are two things. First of all, employers were keen to support people around their mental health and well-being. But too often it's a bit of a tick box exercise. You know, we just want to say that we've done this and we've done that, but the results are often not properly assessed. So I think a number of employers have done what they usually do, i.e. signposting. And, you know, they may have an employee assistance program with counseling available and other advice, financial support, etc. But also we've seen a number of employers signposting other services, whether in the local areas, or there have been a number of online seminars, webinars from the ACAS conciliation body, for example, but also Museum Association have done so. And there's been a flurry of activities. So I think it was important for employer to flag up what was available rather than always reinvent the wheel. Also, some employers already had a staff network for mental health and disability. So where they existed, they should have, or they have supported those networks more importantly. But also in other areas, the staff network haven't been active and haven't received proper support from the employer. It means that that wasn't available for colleagues or individuals. I'll say two other things. I think a key thing, especially as people are returning to work, and Sam already touched on that, is to take into consideration individual circumstances. And my union PCS argued that there should be individual risk assessments or assessments that can take into consideration health and disability and caring arrangement. But also, let's not forget the disproportionate impact of COVID on BAME people, Black and ethnic minority people. And there will be additional anxiety around this because the collective trauma they're going through, because they're seeing a lot more relative dying or colleagues, and they know they are more at risk. So that should also be taken into consideration. Also, people working from home, what type of support are they getting? Quite often, and too often, unfortunately, is contact your line manager. I don't think that's good enough, especially that we need to provide additional training for line managers. We can't refer people to the line manager and then the line manager not being trained or supported. And I think that's something for the future that I'm sure the Museum Association is working on, and I've already done activity about that. I think that's going to be really important because more and more we rely on managers to deal with those problems.
Yeah. Just really want to pick up on something that Sam said within the context of this question, but also we've just had a sort of a question that's come up, and again it's around communication. In my experience, often there's a difference between listening and hearing. So, you know, hearing is the physiological, the anatomical process of what we might hear, but the extent to which we actually listen is the cognitive process. And I think that's that difference between thinking it's a tick box exercise as opposed to an exercise of actually making change, as opposed to being that here. And I think that the concept of when do you communicate and how much, you know, having delivered communication programs in the past, is what's even more important is even when you have nothing to say. When you have nothing to say, communicate that you have nothing to say, because otherwise that's storytelling, that's catastrophizing, and which is real and heartfelt, just carries on. You know, why aren't they telling me? Are they telling everybody else? And certainly some of the inconsistencies around communication. I heard one story where an individual only found out that their organisation was letting staff back in through a post on Twitter, and they saw their peers becoming unfurloughed by seeing a narrative on Twitter. So that communication side is really important. So one of the questions that came up was around, I suppose, the nature of the communication, the timeliness of the communication from organisations around reopening. Do you have a sense around what is good practice, or a sense around organisations that have done it well around communicating with their staff whilst they're off? Anyone?
Gonna do a little plug for my own museum here, but I think they did, People's History Museum did very, very well at communicating to staff throughout. We had weekly updates from the director letting us know what was going on, what the plans were. We had updates whenever people were furloughed. We've had updates when people were brought off furlough. It was even just done through emails on a weekly basis, just saying, oh, there's not really any change, but this is what I've been up to at the weekend, just sort of kept that dialogue going. And now we have sort of staff meetings. We're a small team, so we can get away with having all of our staff on Zoom, but we're having staff meetings every month as well. So I think it doesn't necessarily need to be every week, but a regular update, a regular timetabled update, so you know sort of when to look out for it as well, is a good idea, because people like structure, and that's one of the things that's missing at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just looking at some of the questions coming in just to make sure that we're going to be meeting all your needs. And I would concur. One of the things I put in place, the Friday the 20th of March is an email to all of my AMA candidates. And every Friday they get an email. Sometimes it's full, sometimes it's not, but it's something that they know that's coming, and it's transparent and it's expected. And that visibility is really important. So those examples, those suggestions that you've experienced is great. Any other good practice, Victoria or Clara?
Well, I don't know about good practice, maybe bad practice, sorry. I think around the communication, too often we do rely on email, and I know during the lockdown, everything online has been, the priority, but let's not forget about groups of workers who do not have access to emails or the internet system. Some people haven't got internet at home. And I think that, we need to think outside the box, not to exclude those people as we move more and more to digital. So I think from a union perspective, like the employer, we were doing regular communication, but also we were contacting individuals to have phone conversations. I think some of employers have done that as well on a weekly basis, which is really important. But around reopening and communication, for me, the key is plenty of notice. And also making all the documents, the policy available to people and providing that information, because as a union rep, too often I've got members phoning me in panic, oh, I'm supposed to return to work in a week time. That's really little notice to process coming out of a lockdown and actually returning to work. And then I realized they weren't explained about the different safety measures. And no, they didn't read the email on the internet. They weren't explained that they were provisioned for people with different barriers coming back to work, and that we could adapt the situation to their own personal circumstances. So I think that notice and communication about the measures is a really big key.
Yeah, that transparency, so people don't have to ask on their behalf where they may already be feeling a little bit vulnerable about that completely. You don't want to be singled out necessarily. Yeah, really good. Victoria, anything else around communication engagement in terms of its impact on well-being?
I mean, I echo that point about not just relying on email. I think that's vitally important, just because email is not very reliable sometimes. But also I'm kind of aware of it a little bit from another angle, trying to, because I've been involved in conversations about the DCMS guidance with various arts organisations and how ambiguous and non-specific some of it has been, and what a struggle that's been for institutions to then try to translate that into something that really supports their practice. And I think, so I suppose I have some sympathy with people who are trying to figure out how to communicate something when they're also receiving very complex and unclear messages. But that isn't really that's not really me describing good practice. But I think perhaps it's a complicated space at the moment, and communication is, even if you're communicating the fact that you're not quite sure how you can take the next steps, then it's still worth doing.
Thank you. I've been looking at all the questions coming through, and I always love it when a question comes in from a member of the audience. So thank you. That sort of resonates with the next question I was going to ask. So one of the questions were, when do we stop talking about resilience? When do we start to move away from the focus of now to actually workforce wellbeing in general? Because, are there any lessons learned? Are there any things that, if we all ruled the world, if we suddenly had that magic wand, we would be saying, this is what's going to have an impact on workforce wellbeing? Of course, appreciating that it's a very individual experience. So I wondered whether, sorry, Victoria, coming straight back to you as well, I'm afraid. But yeah, do you have any hopes for the sector, any sort of lessons that we've learned already, or how we can perhaps, because it isn't always, and certainly I've had conversations that some people have found the particular situation quite energizing. So lots of people have found, I've heard, they've been taken away from micromanaging situations, for example. The research that I've done in the past on bullying, people have said it's been really nice because I've not been in the same space to the person that has been being not nice to me during my time at work. So there are, for some people, this has had a positive impact in terms of their well-being as well. So I think we need to acknowledge that. I just wondered, have you got any hopes for the sector in terms of lessons learned that we can continue thinking about well-being and making the sector a space for good health and safety?
Yeah, I think there's lots of positive stuff, without wishing to be crass about the total crapness of the situation. But I think the big things for me, so I think one huge thing is about trust. I think there's been layers of trust that we haven't seen before. So funders have, in a lot of instances, been trusting organisations to get on with what they do, to adapt their programmes, to be flexible, to sort of trust to their values essentially, and find ways of working. And that's been really great. I think that's produced a lot of really interesting experimental projects that people haven't felt empowered to do in the past. And one of the people I spoke to said that they've been trying to work with mindfulness for years and they've never got anywhere, and it always felt like it was slightly at odds with the organisation, and now suddenly it's sort of locking in with people's understanding of things in a completely different way. So I think that's being mirrored in lots of different ways. Another thing is, so trusting your staff, I think, is a massive thing too. The other big thing is partnership. And we just did a report on projects that have been reaching people who are shielding or vulnerable at home. And the ones that have really, all of those projects were done in partnership, and they were either in partnership with local authorities or the health sector or other community organisations. And it's those, and there's been a lot of energy in these new partnerships. And I think those have been beneficial in all sorts of ways, partly beneficial to the people that they're reaching, partly beneficial to the people who are running the programs, because it just opens up a whole new world of possibilities, really. But it's also just a more realistic way of thinking about the future. We're not going to have the resources to do this on our own, and we really need to be thinking outside the silos of our own practice. And it offers, you know, working with people who don't come from the same headspace as you is good for your well-being. It just, again, I think it just opens up space. So I think there's a lot of possibilities there. But it's all about sort of how we lock into the communities that we're based in, really, and think of well-being as a mutual effort. So it's not about sort of well-being for staff over here, well-being for participants over here, well-being for, you know, whoever. It's all, these things are interconnected, and I think that, you know, we're all realizing that now perhaps more than ever, and that in some ways is the biggest reason to be hopeful.
Yeah, well-being very multi-directional and multifaceted, and for all of those different constituent parts. Thank you. Sam, any hopes or any lessons learned you think that we can take from where we are to the next, whatever that next might be, and longer term?
I think one of my big hopes for the sector is that we can keep some of the flexible working that we've been figuring out over the last few months. Flexible working, whether it's working from home or being able to do slightly different hours, having compressed days, so you work longer hours over 4 days and have an extra day off. Whatever it means for the individual, it can have a real benefit to mental health and our physical well-being as well. And I think a lot of institutions have started to realise that during the pandemic, they've started to go, oh, flexible working is really important at the moment. And I just hope that keeps on, because everyone's proven how much work can be done from home. And so if it helps people who are being bullied in the workplace to work from home a few days a week, then surely that's worth it. And I think the other thing, on a personal note, this whole situation has shown just how much the sector has been trying to do over the last few years. Almost every museum is doing so much work, and everyone's had to pare back what they're doing, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we should be focusing on not spreading ourselves so that we're not taking so much on ourselves, because we all are so into our jobs and we all care so much about the we work too hard and we lose a lack of balance. And even if it means doing 2 exhibitions instead of 3 in a year, if we can do those 2 exhibitions really well without having to spread ourselves and go absolutely run ourselves ragged trying to do everything, then surely that's a good thing as well.
Yeah, that concept of capacity and also core and priorities. I know I'm one of the most guilty people, is I want to do everything and I want to do it now. Yeah, being reined in can help that, especially if you're already passionate. Clara, before we start taking other questions from audience.
Well, I hope that one of the positive we can take from the coronavirus crisis is hopefully this is going to continue to destigmatize mental health issues. We've seen now over the last decade where we talk about mental health far more, employers are embracing mental health. But I think there is a danger as well that we talk far too much about resilience, which put the onus on the individual, on your lifestyle. It's almost your fault if you've got mental health issues. And actually, we should look instead at the structural reasons why it seems that mental health problems are growing in society, regardless of coronavirus, particularly with young people. Why is it deteriorating? What is it in the nature of work that we do, or the pace of work? Many people will say, well, we don't work in a mine. Why did our ancestors didn't have mental health issues? And you work in an office, in a comfortable environment. Why are you getting mental health issues? I think the pace of life is much more rapid. Therefore, at work, the expectation about delivery of projects, constant change, and employers are the first one to embrace change, to ask us to do so. as if change in itself is a good thing. Well, not necessarily. Let's not forget as well that the well-being industry is actually a multi-billion pound industry across the world for profit. So I think we need to be very vigilant in striking the right balance between, sort of contracting companies to give us the services as well, and actually understanding mental health. I think one of the things we need is a better provision of the public NHS on mental health. It shouldn't be up to an employer to be responsible for employees' mental health, or certainly not only. But nowadays, unfortunately, you can't get appointments with psychologists, counseling, or it takes months and months. So where do you go? The employee assistance program, which are often for-profit companies running those. But as employers, I think in the sector, I think there is a need to develop more comprehensive mental health policies to bring back all of the thinkings and the different measures and the good practice to make sure that we have got policies in the workplace. In particular, I want to see the development of better adjustments for people with mental health issues. In particular, if they are classified as disability, because let's not forget that the definition of disability under the Equality Act is, a health condition that is impeding on your ability to carry your day-to-day life in a normal way, but also if it lasts 12 months or more. So actually a lot of people would be protected by the Equality Act if they are struggling with their mental health, and I've got no doubt that more people will come into this category following coronavirus, because the impact is going to be medium and long term, not just short term. Therefore, understanding what adjustment we can put in place is a key. And where I work, we did put in place a staff network, and part of the activities we carried out was to establish a list of examples of what adjustment you can put in place for mental health issues. It can be as simple as a flexible start and finish, so you can avoid public transport when it's peak time, or you can avoid to be stressed out about being late all the time. It can be having provision of quiet spaces where people can take a quick break there, and they may use their coping mechanism. And sometimes access to such a space for 15 minutes will make a massive difference, where you can actually return to work and carry on with your day. If you didn't have access to that, you may go into meltdown and you may have to go home sick and be sick for a few days. So I think that's something to explore. Finally, I think there is scope, and we've already seen a number of museums working on those issues, is how we can link more the work we do around collections and museum activities to health and well-being and mental health. So we've got the example of the Liverpool museums have done great work around dementia, for example, with their House of Memory program, actually externally funded. So at a time where funding is scarce as well, like how we can rethink that. We've all seen the statistics that people who visit museums have got better mental health than others. Whether or not it's also because of the level of wealth that people who tend to go to museums, I would argue that possibly is. But I think engaging with the art is very important. And during the entire lockdown, we've seen a flurry of creativity of people to help with their mental health as well as keep themselves occupied. But we've seen online artists and production. And I think that museums and more generally the cultural sector should be an entire part of coronavirus recovery for well-being and mental health of the country. And that's why it's great to see a rescue package from the government, but if it's just going to be able to allow the sector to scrap around and the big institution to survive, and creating a devastation into the programs and employments in the sector, that's not good enough. It should be a proper strategy, put the arts at the center of COVID recovery, I would argue.
So we've talked a lot, and thank you very much for those reflections and suggestions. I hope everybody that's a leader, manager or supervisor is hastily taking notes around what they can do within their own sphere of influence. And I suppose that's something I would really challenge, is that sometimes we wait for an intervention or a programme to come from above. And actually in my experience of work has often been moderated by my line manager in the first instance. And so I think even from that direct line management support, that can be really helpful, and you can make those changes without waiting for a paper to go up the hierarchy and back down. We had a question around support for freelancers within all of this. So, you know, our sector is complex. We have a diverse workforce profile in terms of mix of volunteers, freelancers and paid staff. Now, we've been focusing very much from an organisational perspective. Is anyone aware of any organisations working more sort of closely with freelancers that operate? And of course, freelancers can be members of unions, etc. as well. So, yeah, any reflections on that? Or anyone from the audience, if you've got any ideas or suggestions as well, put that in the chat function. But Victoria?
There are quite a few freelancer support groups, which the questioner may already be aware of, but there is a freelancer task force now, which is working with the Cultural Recovery Task Force as a sort of subsection of that. And there's lots of galvanizing around various different entities. We've got a resource on our coronavirus resource page that links you to various bits of support for freelancers, so I can put that in the chat box. But yeah, there's certainly some groupings out there, and we work a lot with freelancers in the Alliance. In fact, I'd probably say the bulk of the people who are members of the organisation are freelance.
And certainly I would just highlight the really good work that Museum Freelance does. So if you aren't aware of their work, their website, their Twitter, they're focused very clearly on supporting and lobbying around this area in terms of COVID response. Anything else about freelancers? Sorry.
One more to jump in there with in terms of freelance. I think the What Next groups are really helpful and have been doing a lot of lobbying around freelance as well. I'll put a link up as well for them.
Yeah, that's really, really important. Clara?
Yeah, I think but as a trade union, we don't tend to represent freelancers, and often freelance staff are not in a trade union, which make it more difficult to organize collectively. And I think that's a bit missing. And I hope that some trade unions are going to be looking into that. Certainly, back to that work with a lot of technicians in some of the galleries. They represent a lot of freelance people. But as PCS union, we were very clear when the lockdown happened. We were asking for, full pay for directly employed staff, but also people who work for contractors. But we also asked for every freelance commitment to be honored, and it happened in a lot of national institutions. Obviously, it was a temporary measure because you only get booked so much in advance, so quite quickly the work had dried out. But I think also what we're seeing in the sector, and all respect for freelancers, by the way, but unfortunately what we're seeing is a bit of exploitation of freelance workers, especially those who are struggling to actually make ends meet just with their freelance work. So quite often freelance people, they are also employed in the sector, maybe on a 0 hours contract, or some of them have got 2 other jobs. And I think museums should be reflecting on that, and maybe think about, well, if you've got employees who've got skills, etc., especially right now where they may be struggling, they're working part-time for you, but they've got freelance work. Can we use the skill? Can we commission them to do particular pieces of work? I think that's something that we should certainly explore.
I've got, and I'm conscious of time, so there's sort of 3 questions that I think would really be great to explore. So 3 of them sort of focus around furloughed staff. So you might want to answer them all as a part of it, but there's something around how do you engage those furloughed staff at the moment so they still feel part of the organisation? There's something also around, do you have any advice to ensure that there isn't a divide when furloughed staff coming back in, so they're then working alongside staff that haven't been furloughed? There's also some sort of sense around how can you support furloughed staff coming back to work and sort of reacquainting them and getting them up to speed without necessarily overwhelming them. And I don't know if you've got any sort of insights around how to manage those different groups. Sam, you're nodding, so I'm going to come to you first.
Okay. I was actually just thinking about something Victoria said earlier about making sure you have spaces for communication. And I think that's going to be really important as museums go forward to deal with the gap between furloughed staff and people who've been working through the pandemic, because those experiences are so completely different. And I've seen in the sector throughout people who are working who want to be furloughed and people who are furloughed who want to be back at work. And I think the only way to really deal with that divide is to get people talking about their experiences and showing that being furloughed wasn't just a holiday where it was really easy and people just got to have a jolly for 3 weeks at a time. But at the same time, working from home throughout the pandemic hasn't been like normal work. It hasn't just been like when you go into the office and you have fun with your work colleagues and you just get your work done. So I think encouraging communication, encouraging open and honest communication is going to be really, really important for that. And I think both furloughed staff coming back into work and management and their colleagues need to remember it's going to be almost like starting a job again with that. Everyone knows when they've started a new job, you have a couple of weeks where you're just exhausted at the end of the day because you're taking on so much information. And it's going to be very similar, especially with the new ways of working that everyone's having to deal with. So everyone has to give themselves a break and give other people a break, let people have more time off if needed, let them have longer tea breaks, or just don't expect them to be able to do the same amount of work as you would be doing outside of this situation. It's taken, I've been working since the beginning of the pandemic, and it took me months to realise that I wouldn't be getting the same amount done as before the pandemic happened. And people who've been on furlough don't have that luxury of several months of lockdown to come to terms with that. So everyone needs to be kind to themselves and be kind to each other as well.
Any other reflections around that furlough, non-furlough challenge? Victoria?
Just to add that I think it comes back to what Sam was saying earlier, actually, about paring back programs and how that may have been one of the sort of positives in some ways. And I think that, you know, moving into this next phase, there may be a sort of expectation that we can somehow move back to a normal level of programming. And I think exactly what you were just saying, Sam, that's not going to be realistic, and we need to be sort of temper our expectations essentially. And in some cases, I think that might involve having quite strong conversations with funders who I would hope would be sympathetic to this issue. But you know, I think sort of being brave about saying we're not going to be able to achieve the same level of work for a gazillion different reasons, and a big one is going to be building those relationships back.
And I think certainly that concept of capacity is really important. Some of the conversations I've been having with people, though, there's a real sense of loss around they've been waiting to do a project for such a long time. They've finally got the funding to do it. And now that is, rightly so, being reworked because of that. So again, even the brilliant, there's less workload, still may have an impact. So that nuanced impact around how somebody's individual well-being is affected just needs to be really appreciated. I just want to come on to probably our last question, but I'm keeping an eye open on other questions coming through. There's a question specifically from a line manager who was like, well, how do they make sure that they are continuing to manage and supervise well, but also look after their own mental health, but equally being told that there's lots of work to be done from on high? So almost sometimes the line manager may feel as if they're in that rock and a hard place between keeping the people up here happy and the people here happy in their teams, but also that can only be achieved through maintaining their own good well-being. I don't know if anyone's got any suggestions around that. I'm going to come to Clara first because we haven't heard from her from the previous question, if that's all right.
I think it's very important that obviously land managers need to look after themselves. And as a trade union rep, you know, I'm constantly reminding myself of this. So I totally get it. I think it's important that you start organizing dialogue amongst managers in the organization and have meetings to plan around how you can, you know, strike the right balance, really. but also insist to have additional trainings and flag up about workload, because we can't have on one hand the employer expecting you to do all this work, but also looking after people's mental health and well-being. To be honest, I don't believe managers should have as much responsibilities in managing people's mental health. I've tried to advocate for a number of years now that we should have welfare officers available in the workplace, because often, it may be easier to speak to somebody who is actually a health professional and may not work with you on a daily basis. Opening up about your problem to your line manager, sometimes it may be like personal traumas, etc., can be very difficult, but everybody's got a different experience. But I think far too much is put on the shoulder of managers when it comes to mental health of the employees.
Yeah, the really good reflection. Anything else, either Sam or Victoria, in relation to that particular question about managers being like this, between that rock and a hard place, and how do they look after themselves? Anyone?
I can really relate to that. I mean, we're a tiny organisation, so it's a little different from the setup where you'd have a number of managers you could potentially work with. But so speaking to anybody else who's in a small organisation, I think it is a real challenge, and I would just say try to feel confident in your right to be able to say, to explain your workload properly, and to sort of reduce the demands on yourself. And because we haven't historically taken mental health seriously in our organisations, it can be quite hard to say, this is taking up a proportion of my time. Looking after my staff is taking up a proportion of my time. But I think we all have to try to just be more honest about that and more confident, and realise that that is part of our job. It's not just an extra, it's an intrinsic. It does take a proportion of time to look after both your own mental health and your colleagues. But I do completely echo what Clara says. I think if there is the capacity to bring in people who can be independently kind of conducting pastoral care, then that is a great way forward. So, conscious of time, so before I hand back to Rebecca and before I do my summing up, I just wanted to just double check, is there anything that you feel that you would like to share with our audiences that you don't think either has had airtime, or something you'd like to signpost, something that perhaps hasn't come out in the fullness of the discussion from any of our panellists? Sam Jenkins.
Thank you. One thing I'd like to signpost is a discovery I made today, that the charity Mind has a pack available that you can download called a Wellbeing Action Plan, and it's available for employees or for line managers and employers. So it goes through almost like a little questionnaire, so you can write in your own answers of what helps your mental health, what employers can do to help, just to help to bring up a sort of plan of action for how you can feel supported in work, or how you can support your reportees. And I just also want to finish on saying that it's a massive time of change, but it also means that it's the perfect time for us in the sector and the sector as a whole to challenge some of the more toxic cultural practices that have been prevalent in the sector, whether it's about well-being or about institutional racism or classism or any of the other problems. This is the perfect time to start changing those. So hopefully we can actually enforce some of that.
Thank you, Sam. Anything, Victoria? Clara?
I think for me, the message to employers is that they should not be scared to be wrong and to make mistakes. And when they do, they shouldn't hide them. They should actually be really open about them and learn from the lessons from them. Because, to be honest, I am sick of representing people with mental health disabilities in the workplace who are treated very badly, and where actually direct discrimination and institutional discrimination is unfortunately far too often present. Myself, speaking out on discrimination, I actually found myself suspended from work a few months ago because of it. So we shouldn't silence people who are speaking out. We should listen to them and try to find remedies and solutions, knowing that it's a very complex topic. We're not going to always get it right, but at least if we recognize our mistakes, then we can move forward in a more positive manner.
Victoria, anything from you as a final word.
You can add anything to what Sam and Clara have said. They just put it brilliantly.
Wonderful. So just a few reflections, but thank you very much for all of your insights. And in my experience, it's having these conversations that it's the most productive, because we all come to all of our professional practice, but specifically wellbeing and workforce issues, from our own particular position. And to hear everyone else's particular position is really important, because that enables us to begin to understand and sympathise, if not empathise, through our own experience with others around what that looks like. The concept that I take away, and I bang on about this all the time, is this concept of resilience being worn as a badge of honour. I mean, I remember back in the day in an organisation I used to work for, I used to say to my manager, thank goodness I'm so resilient, otherwise I'd be off. As if that was a good thing to say, and it wasn't, because actually that was me very clearly, but perhaps not very specifically, saying, I am struggling here. It was said in jest, but it really wasn't meant in jest. And I think that wellbeing plan that Sam just talked about, I think is really great. I think sometimes having your voice or knowing what to say in these situations is hard, and whether it is putting it in an email first, whether it is using an emotions wheel to identify what emotions you're experiencing. And emotions are good. They enable us to communicate to everybody what's important to us. So again, if you're on our Facebook pages for Museum Furloughed or for Leading in Crisis, you will get a plethora of these hints and techniques. The only final thing really I just want to say is I think it's everyone's responsibility. You know, it is around an organisation ensuring that they have a safe space. It's about managers and supervisors having a clear duty of care for their staff and taking that on board. And it's for us to, where we feel able, and I appreciate that's not always the case, is to be able to say, actually, I do need help. And I know for one person, that's not really my MO. I'm not used to that. So that's even hard for me. So I am going to now hand over to Rebecca. I want to thank everybody for your chat. I can't wait to look at it afterwards. Thank you for the questions. I know we haven't been able to get to all of the questions, but we will have a look to see if there's anything we can, as a Museums Association, develop to support those questions, or signpost, or develop resources. So thank you for those insights. But Rebecca, can I hand over to you, please?
Right, yeah, you can. Thank you, Tamsin, and thanks to our panel again. I really don't have anything much more to add. I just wanted to say that I've hope everyone's enjoyed this webinar. Our next coronavirus conversation is on rethinking learning and engagement on the 12th of August. And then we'll be looking at the future of civic museums on the 26th of August. And details of all of those and how to book on the events page of the Museum Association's website. And yeah, just finally, just thanks to everyone that's attended today, for anyone that's asked a question or shared on chat. It's been really great to hear everyone's thoughts and have that solidarity, I suppose, in this time of crisis. And hopefully see you again in 2 weeks for our next discussion. Until then, goodbye. Thank you.